Moral relativism is to view moral judgments are only true or false relative to a specific standpoint. This would mean something may be right in India, but wrong in America. Something may be right to you, but wrong to me. No standpoint is said to be privileged or better than any other. All views would be equally valid. Unlike non-cognitivism, moral relativism accepts moral claims are true or false, but simply doesn't claim they would be objectively true or false. Truth is decided on different levels by different individuals or cultures or ethnic groups. In popular culture, this appears to have become a dominant view. We often hear people preface statements with, "Well, I personally believe this," or say things like, "It feels right to me," and "We all need to figure out what is true for each of us." These are symptoms of a culture that has been founded on moral relativistic views. The question I want to ask is if there is evidence and good reason moral relativism is true, or if there are problems with this line of thinking in metaethics. Moral relativism has been critiqued by several philosophers who have demonstrated it suffers from several problems. Let's begin by first looking at agent relativism. Remember, agent relativism says morality is defined by the individual. So each person will have moral views that are true to them, and every person's moral views would be equally right on the individual level. So this would mean all motivating reasons for morality would be internal, since they all come from the individual. Nothing external can motivate moral behavior, simply because morality is defined and created by the internal motives of each agent. So this would stand in contrast to something like moral realism, which says objective moral facts and duties exist externally to the agent, which motivate agents to act in a certain way. In moral realism, external reasons motivate. Under agent relativism, only internal reasons can motivate, since there is no moral truth or standard outside of each agent, for those who hold there are only internal reasons and that there are no external reasons. However, if we can show external reasons can motivate, this would pose a problem for agent relativism, and there seems to be arguments which we can use to show this. Consider an example. Perhaps there is a grumpy old man who automatically assumes his neighbors are mean and out to get him. However, one day a family moves in next door and is very nice to him. They bake him food and help him with his yard work and do everything they can to help him as their elder. After a while, the old man changes his attitude and is no longer grumpy, but is nice and kind to the family. The question we must ask is if the motivation to change his attitude was external or internal. Before the family moved in, could the old man have decided on his own to be nice to his neighbors? Arguably, this wasn't possible. When the family first approached him, he was angry and distant. So the challenge to agent relativism is that if we think the old man did have a reason to be nice, but there was no way for him to be motivated to change on his own, then we can infer yet a normative reason that was external to him. So the evidence would say there are external reasons, and thus show there are external normative factors. As Russ Shafer-Landau says, "It is true of many different kinds of people that if they were somehow to look beyond the picture of things they have grown used to, they would find themselves with an outlook, a plan of life, and a set of circumstances that they would find more valuable than they could ever have imagined. In such cases, realizing the relevant benefits often requires a change of character. The goodness available only to those who make such changes may be so valuable as to make it true that one has, despite one's present motivations, a reason to make necessary changes." So if we can be externally motivated by normative reasons, then that would mean agent relativism is incorrect and morality is not defined by the individual. Agent relativism also makes morality quite ad hoc. If moral facts depend on the individual, then what is to stop me from changing my moral views tomorrow, depending on what side of the bed I woke up on? If right and wrong is simply dependent on me, then it becomes very arbitrary, and I can simply define morality by what is pleasurable or useful to me, not in any type of internal truth. And I can change this on a whim's notice if I feel like it. In reality, what else would motivate our internal moral truth anyway? Yet, we do not act as if morality can simply be so arbitrary, or should depend on such personal things. And we understand there are external normative reasons that can motivate us or affect our moral views. So this would most likely infer something like cultural relativism or moral realism is true, and morality is defined by something external to the individual. Speaker relativism has its own issues. If you remember, speaker relativism is different from agent relativism, in that agent relativism focuses on the one performing the action. Speaker relativism cares about the one making the claim. In other words, the agent relativist focuses on the person's actions as the moral agent. A speaker relativist focuses on the moral framework as the speaker, who is speaking about another agent's actions. So when I make a moral claim, I'm referring to my moral framework. When you make a moral claim, you're referring to your moral framework. Yet this creates a problem. If I were to say abortion is okay and you said abortion is wrong, then under speaker relativism, there seems to be no shared meaning. Disagreement depends on shared meaning. So for example, if I say a plane flies through the air and you say no it doesn't, but we find out you mean a carpenter's tool, we realize there is no disagreement because there is no shared meaning. If speaker relativism is true, we cannot ever disagree because we never have shared meaning. What is right for you is not right for me. As Ragnar Francén says, the problem for moral speaker relativism is that it makes moral assertions made by speakers with different morality be about different things, express different propositions, and that they therefore do not disagree in the intuitive sense when they are involved in moral disputes. Speaker relativists try to avoid this by attempting to divorce the truth conditions of a sentence with the meaning of a sentence. In other words, the meaning of a sentence doesn't determine the conditions under which it is true. But this seems incorrect, as David Lewis noted. A meaning for a sentence is something that determines the concessions under which the sentence is true or false. If I say, the snakes are alive, but I'm talking in code to relay a hidden message that the enemies are about to attack, the meaning will determine whether or not it is true. We cannot simply divorce truth conditions from meaning. Therefore, if there has to be shared meaning, as speaker relativists have to acknowledge, then this creates a problem, as Andrew Fisher says. If the speaker relativist claims that where people have different moral frameworks, there can be a common meaning, and if meaning determines the truth conditions, then it seems that the speaker relativist is committed to there being common truth conditions across cases of different moral frameworks. But then, of course, it is a mystery why their position should be called relativism. If truth and meaning are not relative to individual moral frameworks, what is left for them to be relative about? Perhaps we have shared meaning under cultural relativism. Perhaps the problem with both agent relativists and speaker relativists is they do not realize they get their moral framework from larger cultures that determine truth conditions and meaning in moral frameworks, as well as explain why there are external normative reasons that motivate us. Remember that cultural relativism teaches that morality is defined by the culture. Individuals get their moral views from a larger culture, which defines the moral framework for individuals in these cultures. And perhaps this is correct, as it appears morality does differ from culture to culture. In the West, we prize equal rights for men and women, whereas in parts of Africa, women are often treated as second-class citizens. In traditional Christian cultures, abortion is perceived to be wrong, whereas in more secular cultures, abortion is perceived as neither good or bad. So perhaps morality is defined by the culture. Well, the problem with this line of thinking is, as we have already noted in our defense of moral realism. Cultural disagreements do not necessarily mean morality is subjective, for the same reason different beliefs about the age of the earth does not mean science is subjective. There is a real world out there we can discover, and certain humans are only in error when they miscalculate the age of the earth. Moral facts and duties may be objectively true, and cultural differences may just mean certain cultures are better at understanding objective moral facts and duties, whereas some are simply incorrect in their moral assessments of the facts. Second, cultures tend to have wide agreement on values and duties, and the actual differences seem to lie in underlying factual misconceptions. If one tribe thinks it is okay to kill members of a neighboring tribe, it usually is from an underlying factual belief about the humanity of the other tribe, like that the other tribe is not fully human and that they are really demons or monsters. If you can convince the first tribe the other tribe is just as human as they are, they tend to change their view on if they should be killed off or not. Moral differences between cultures tend to be based on factual errors, not actual value differences. See my video on moral realism for a better explanation of moral convergence. So the existence of different cultural views on morality doesn't actually count as evidence for moral relativism. Plus, cultures are typically hard to define. Where are the governing lines that separate cultures? And when do they apply? What if a Muslim family from China moves to America? What cultural morality should they be subject to? Their family, their origin, or the current culture they live in? Where exactly are the lines dividing cultural morality? At the regional level, national, village, family? Where exactly does a cultural set of moral values begin and end? What if a man from culture A has sex with a woman from culture B in a country where culture C is present? By what cultural morality are they judged by? If you say there are some kind of external rules which govern these cultural divides, and decide where different cultural moral views apply, how is that not setting an objective standard we must abide by, beyond the cultural norms? If truth and meaning are not relative to cultural moral frameworks, what is left for them to be relative about? Objective laws which govern and divide morality into different cultures is a form of moral realism, where values and facts are decided not on what the culture sets, but on governing principles not decided by humans. The other issue is cultural relativism suffers from something known as the reformer's dilemma. If cultural relativism is true, then it is logically impossible for a society to have a virtuous moral reformer, like Gandhi or Dr. King. The idea behind reforms as a culture or society is no longer conforming to the objective moral law, and therefore needs to change. If cultural relativism is true, then these men were not virtuous. They were in error for going against the cultural moral norms. As Emery's Westacott says, moral relativism seems to imply, for instance, that the majority can never be wrong on moral matters, and a corollary of that is that within a given community, dissidents must always be wrong. So cultural relativism cannot account for reforms or reformers, because to call for moral reform requires a vantage point outside and above the culture's moral norms from which to judge they are wrong. But it is exactly such a vantage point that cultural relativism denies. Even many advocates of moral relativism end up creating an objective standard by promoting the virtue of tolerance. Not all moral relativists, but many preach we must be tolerant of other cultures. This is an underlying foundation for many people holding to moral relativism, that we must be tolerant of different ideas. But the idea of tolerance of different moral views is preached as if it is a universal obligation. If relativism is true, then the principle of tolerance doesn't express a transcultural obligation that is binding on everyone. In other words, it is merely an expression of values associated with one culture or relative framework. Pragmatically speaking, if the relativist preaches tolerance should be abided by everyone, and everyone should respect different cultural moral views, they are pushing an objectively binding moral value. But they cannot if it is all relative. What if it is someone's cultural norm to reject tolerance and moral views of other cultures, and seek to install their own moral framework on everyone? So basically, if you think everyone should be tolerant of other moral frameworks, you are not promoting relativism, but a universal obligation. These issues and more cause problems for moral relativists, and seem to suggest the evidence is pointing towards the idea there is an objective moral reality that is not defined by cultures, societies, or individuals. Relativism may be popular among modern laymen, but it suffers from serious logical difficulties that simply cannot be ignored.